Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to see you all. Thanks for joining us at this panel. Those of you who have met me before know I don't normally sound like this, so I'm very grateful for the microphone today. But because of that, I'm also going to do something that I think is probably good pedagogy and let the students and you all do more of the talking. So I'm so thrilled that today we have 5 really amazing students from various schools on campus. I've asked them to think about a couple of things, but I've also warned them that I have a couple of surprise questions for them. Those of you who I have spoken to a little bit told me that you don't get enough chances to hear from students, and so I'm hoping that today we can let them share with us some of the really powerful and, frankly, not so great experiences they've had with peer learning, and then I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit of time for questions from the audience as well. So I'd like to start by just having them each introduce themselves, and then we'll go into some of the things that I've asked them to think about.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Kochis. I'm currently a fourth-year student at Harvard Medical School, and I also took a year in the midst of my medical studies at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The main collaborative learning activities I'll be talking about are the case-based collaborative learning style that is featured at HMS.
And Michael, can you tell us, when I reached out, why you were excited to do this today?
Yeah, I was thrilled to hear about this program happening today because throughout my master's degree studies, I worked on developing a curriculum specifically for the medical school's case-based collaborative learning environment that will equip students to better engage with one another throughout their activities. I can talk a little bit more about that throughout the panel.
Thank you. Julia.
Hi, my name is Julia Losner. I am a student at the college. I'm a junior studying human developmental and regenerative biology. On campus, I've served as a course assistant or peer study leader for a couple of freshman introductory biology and chemistry courses, so I'd be happy to talk about my experience with that, both being a student in those courses and then later being part of the teaching team. Also, I'm involved in a couple of extracurriculars that have kind of a peer-to-peer educational component. One of those is the Radcliffe Choral Society, so it's not only a musical group, but we also run a 501c3 nonprofit, and so I'd be happy to talk about the dynamics of being involved in management as well as being involved in a student group on the ground level as well.
And Julia, what was it that made you want to participate today?
Yeah, so I really enjoy kind of peer-to-peer interactions. It's something that really speaks to me, and it's something that I personally wasn't really involved in before I came to college. And before I came to college, I was very independent in my activities and my studying, and so when I came to Harvard and was kind of introduced to this different way of learning and interacting with others, that's something that really resonated with me, and I wanted to get more involved in it.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Niall Williams. I am a senior in the college. I am studying sociology as a pre-med student, so my life is a lot of fun. I have had the opportunity and pleasure of actually working with Julia in LPSA as a peer study leader, which is analogous to a course assistant. I also serve as a peer mentor through several cultural organizations on campus, as well as pre-professional organizations. And outside of my time here at Harvard, I've served as a course assistant and a member of a teaching staff at the George Washington University in educating high school students about medicine and health.
And why did you want to be here today?
I felt like it would be a lot of fun. I really enjoy talking to other people about my experiences as a course assistant because I felt like my experiences in chemistry weren't very strong before I came to college, and to change that narrative, going from someone who dreaded chemistry and becoming a course assistant in chemistry, that's like high tier plot for a novel. So I felt like it would be great to come and talk about that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Lena. I'm a senior at college and I study history of science. Outside of my coursework, I'm pretty involved at Y2Y, a student-run homeless shelter in Harvard Square. And I also am a tutor at the Writing Center, so helping other undergraduates with their writing assignments. And so both of those involve a lot of kind of peer learning, I think very different, but I'm excited to talk about that.
Any particular reason why you wanted to be here today, Lena?
Yeah, I think that at Harvard I've learned a lot from my professors, but an equal amount also from my peers. And so I just want to talk about that and share about that.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Max Yorkoffski. I'm a 7th year doctoral candidate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I think there's kind of two big reasons why I'm excited to be here today. One is I, over these 7 years, have developed a lot of experience as a student in different kinds of courses that try to use peer learning methods. I've been a TF for a number of different courses serving undergraduates, master students, doctors of education leadership, and teachers and principals who come to the campus for professional learning. So I've thought a lot about this stuff and would be happy to share some of my reflections on when it works well and doesn't work well. The other reason is I'm writing my dissertation on reforms to education that rely on peer learning among teachers by having teachers work together, looking at data, come up with solutions or improve their practice. And I think that can be both a powerful way of organizing teacher learning, but also something that comes with risks and doesn't always work. So I'm studying when it is useful and when it's not.
Great, thank you so much. I hope you're all as excited as I am. These are some very thoughtful students who have engaged in various kinds of peer experiences, but as you can see, they're also eager to share those with us. So pretty much the best case scenario here. So the first thing I've asked our panelists to think about are to reflect on experiences with peer learning that were really positive for them, and to come up with 3 adjectives that describe those positive experiences. I know that we'll get a chance to hear about some of the anecdotal kind of experiences that they've had, but I've wanted to ask them to do some of that abstract work for us and think about what made those experiences so great, or what are some of the ways that they would describe them. So I'm gonna ask you all, since I did give you some advance notice about this, to share. And if we get too many copied responses, I will come back to you to generate some more. So I'd really like us to get to 15, since that's 3 for each of you. All right, so there's real benefit in going first. Anyone want to start? You can start with just 1, too, if you want. Lena, go ahead.
So I think, the experience that has been out of a lot of the peer learning, peer teaching things that I'll talk about kind of at Y2Y, which, like I said, is a student-run homeless shelter, and it's for young adults, so those aged 18 to 24 who are experiencing homelessness. So all the sort of student staff are around the same age or even a bit younger than the guests that we serve. And so I think a specific time that many times that like learning takes place, I'd say that my first adjective is that it's unexpected. And so it's not, I think a lot of the things that we'll be talking about are sort of structured peer learning where like kind of both parties have expectations on either side. And I think a lot of the learning that happens at Y2Y is sort of very authentic and unstructured, unplanned. And a lot of times it's also, I think the best learning is unequal, which maybe is a surprise, but because of sort of the power dynamics that exist at a shelter like this, where student staff have the power to give out consequences for guest actions or kind of enforce like our shelter policies. When guests open up and share to us, I think it's sort of necessarily a little bit unequal in that we're more listening and just kind of validating, but not sharing ourselves. And so I'd say, unexpected, unequal, but still reciprocal. In that I think we're still both gaining something. Like I'm gaining an understanding about the guests' lives and where they're coming from, and we're both kind of, I think, gaining trust for each other. So I'd say that it's kind of an unconventional experience, but my words would be unexpected, unequal, reciprocal.
Great, thank you so much. Niall,
I would say the first thing that comes to mind when I think about positive peer learning experiences is fun. Learning sometimes, especially when you're thinking about new material and hard concepts, even in STEM and when you're working with new things, can be very boring and very hard to digest when you're not interested or you feel like it's too difficult. So the educators who have made things fun for me have been some of my favorites. I would say the second adjective for me would be accessible. a lot of my peer educators have tried to make learning accessible to me, so they're not always at the board. Sometimes they're drawing pictures with me. Sometimes they're reading things out loud. They're really working to see what works well for me in terms of learning. And in turn, I've tried to do the same with my own teaching experience. And I would say the last adjective would be honest. I want my educators to be honest with me. And I want to be honest with the people that I'm working with as well. So I think in setting that precedent and saying, listen, I know you may not want to hear this right now, but this is the truth, has helped me in the long run, and it's helped the people that I've worked with in the long run.
Great, thank you. So we have 6 really good ones, juicy ones so far. Unexpected, unequal, reciprocal, fun, accessible, and honest. All right. Who's going to go next? Julia, go ahead.
So I'd say the first one for me would be organic. When I think of experiences with peer learning that I've been involved in, the ones where I've gotten the most out of them have been the ones that kind of evolved where I didn't expect them to. So as a student sitting in another teaching fellow's office hours, and I turn to the person next to me, or the person next to me turns to me, and spontaneously we just start going over concepts. Those have been some of the most valuable experiences for me with peer learning, because they're not forced. Then another one would be balanced. For me, I feel that when I'm asking somebody else for help and they're also giving me help back, and then we can reverse that and do the opposite for each other, it makes things a lot more egalitarian, and that really helps. The dynamic isn't so much that somebody else is over here on top and somebody else is below them. It's more of an equal exchange. And the third would be informative. So I find that for me, I learn best, or one way that really helps inform me about what I know and what I don't know, is when I try to teach it to someone else. So if I'm explaining a concept to somebody and I realize, oh, wait, hold on, did that just make sense? Do I maybe not understand this as well as I thought it did? That can be incredibly enlightening for me, in order to figure out also where I might need to brush up on my material and vice versa.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Michael, do you want to go next?
Thank you.
Yeah.
My 3 adjectives are engaging, active, and transformative. So in comparing collaborative learning environments to the standard lecture-based format, which I'm so used to, I'd say the first thing that comes to mind is engaging, and that it's so easy to lose myself in the content of our activities. And I find that I'm very hardly looking at the clock and thinking, is class almost over? The second one is active. And this is similarly when people come together and are trying to solve a problem with one another. We're each picking up different roles. Maybe one of us is going to the whiteboard to take notes and another one is brainstorming, and then we'll switch that up in a little bit. And that's part of what helps keep it so engaging. And then the last one, transformative. In addition to being informed by the new content that I'm acquiring, both in terms of the class content as well as the group processes, I feel transformative better describes this sort of development that I'm undergoing throughout all this, and that it's not just teaching me about how I existed previously, but changing me in ways from what I existed before.
Great, thank you so much. Max?
So the first word I thought about was authentic. By that I mean you're doing some kind of real activity that would take place in society, not some kind of contrived activity. So my advisor, who I'm stealing a little bit from, talks about when you learn to play baseball, you don't just spend hours learning to pitch and then learning to run to first base and then just batting. You play games, and it's messy, and so it's like playing the whole game at the junior level is kind of what people call it. So when can you find activities that resemble the kinds of activities people will be doing in the real world? So that's authentic. The second one is sustained. I feel like when I've had less successful ones, they're rushed, they're quick, but a lot of the most powerful experiences are sustained over a long period of time. So you can kind of, again, do something that's more authentic, and so you can build relationships and deepen your reflection upon that activity over time. And then the third one that I want to focus on is aligned. I think there's kind of the two kinds of alignment that I think are important. One is aligned with the objectives of the disciplinary material. So making sure that you're not just doing an activity for the sake of the activity, but the activity actually supports some kind of instructional objective. And the second part of that is aligned with your own goals as a participant. So do you find some meaning in what you're doing? Is there a reason? Is there something you want to get out of it? Some kind of end goal that, that matters to you as a participant?
Wow, okay, great, thank you. Again, some really wonderful ones. I'm gonna list them all, but then I want to take just a couple minutes to know if any of these were surprising to any of you. Unexpected, unequal, reciprocal, fun, accessible, honest, organic, balanced, informative, engaging, active, transformative, authentic, sustained, aligned. Anything in there that surprises you about some of the qualities that are shared among positive peer learning experiences? Or anything that you find challenging in there? Yeah.
I found unexpected that it was unexpected.
Okay. So unexpected was unexpected. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So the unequal, I didn't find that necessarily surprising, but I felt like it was real.
Yeah.
But it also, I'd like to hear the discussion about unequal and balance.
Yeah.
Because I felt that.
Right. So how do we have both of those as qualities of a positive experience, right? So great. Any other surprises or things that piqued your interest there? Yeah, Carrie?
I'm wondering a little bit about organic.
Uh-huh.
As someone who mostly works in a classroom setting, how to make something that happens happen without seeming like I structured everything along the way.
Right. I think that goes along actually with unexpected, right? That sense that maybe you didn't script it or you did script it, but still something could come out of that that maybe wasn't in your plan. Okay. We're not going to answer all of these questions. Sorry. We only got an hour, so yeah.
I think aligned also goes with that. So I 100% agree with the importance of alignment between activity and, whatever the broad learning objective is. But I think that also brings into question, to what extent can peers design an aligned kind of conversation, and to what extent is there another architect, like
Right.
a teacher, that has to be involved setting that up so peers can have learning among each other, but towards a specific goal. Because if neither one is an expert yet, then there might need to be some expertise to kind of set up that opportunity for them.
Right. Right. Yes.
I think probably the only thing that I was expecting somebody to say that I didn't hear was that they felt challenged. Because I think sometimes I've seen in student groups that they don't feel they've got something to contribute as the experts in the room, and sometimes they feel quite challenged when they're asked to contribute. And I just wondered if any of them actually felt, gosh, how do I begin again? Or was it all very comfortable? Because it sounded fun and comfortable, and they all jumped in immediately, and I'm just wondering.
Well, I'll just remind you that we started with the positive ones. So not that challenge can't be a positive feature as well, right? Yeah. Yes.
I really appreciated honest, and that goes to your comment. How do we as educators actually create these safe environments where students can divulge what they know and what they're uncomfortable with, and ask questions of each other? I mean, is it easier than we think? Do students actually already trust each other, or do we have a lot of work to do as educators to create that safe environment?
So I just want to highlight a couple of the themes that just came out, right? So one is, for those of us who are in the classroom, how do we set the conditions for some of these interactions to take place, whether in the classroom or outside, right? So what sort of foundation have we laid for activities we're doing in the classroom, or the way that we want those relationships to continue afterwards? But I also want to highlight something that both Julia and Niall said about the way that they came to this community and what they understand now about being part of the community, which is that it actually took time to learn how to engage with peers. And certainly we've heard now about some really positive experiences of engaging with peers, but I don't think we should assume that those are somehow inherent to these wonderful people, or that it's just a natural outgrowth of being in college or being in graduate school or being a student, but that in fact those are skills that can be taught and practiced and honed. And so in addition to how do we set the conditions, how do we also act responsibly in teaching our students how to be responsible peers to each other, whether they're learning from each other, coaching each other, tutoring each other, listening to each other. Okay, well, not to take it in a dark direction, but I did also ask them to think about 3 conditions that made a peer learning experience not very positive. And so I'm just going to ask you to kind of popcorn the 3 conditions out. And it's okay if they overlap with some of the words we used the first time. But I just kind of want us to think about not every peer learning experience is a positive one. I think we can admit that. But to think about what maybe made that the case. So anyone, feel free. Yeah, go ahead.
I would definitely say fixed or inflexible as the first word. The second one would be unsafe. The third would be, I don't know what would be a good word for this, but a place where I felt like I couldn't be vulnerable. And I think that's a little bit different than unsafe.
Yes, yeah.
For me, it would be unclear objectives. And then these 2 are kind of contradictory, but too structured and also completely unstructured.
Great, thank you. Who else?
I like the idea of the building on the like structured and like overly rigid idea. I think like close-ended in terms of the knowledge sometimes doesn't work well. I had an experience in a really like an amazing theoretical class, but that relied on a lot of pure learning. But like none of us actually knew the theory that well, and it was really hard. So the professor kept trying to steer it in the right direction, and it just like wasn't a good fit for that reason. So I think because the domain of knowledge was kind of close-ended rather than a more open-ended one, it fit less well.
I think one that I have, which is kind of similar to unclear objectives, but unclear or like different objectives, kind of from
Lena, do you mean that the people in the interaction have different objectives?
Yeah,
Right, okay. Yeah.
kind of different expectations.
Michael, do you want to add anything?
My comments kind of underscored what had been said, but one unique one I will add is related to no feedback on the group's performance. If we're thinking of how an organization can learn over time, it cannot reflect on its process and adjust accordingly unless it gets frequent and specific feedback about how it's doing.
Great. Okay, so I heard a lot of nods and snaps and so I'm really curious to hear some of your reactions to these. And I'm asking in part because I think it helps us to think about the first set of questions, which is what can we as educators do to create positive conditions, but also what are some of the other things we need to be thinking about? And I know that the HILT team, in thinking about this topic of peer learning, knew that it was a rich one. And so one way that I hope our students can help us think about it are to at least identify those moments where things are not going well. And if we can address those, then maybe that takes us further to a place where things are going well. But first, I want to hear some reactions about some of the words that were said. I can reread them while you think. So fixed or inflexible, unsafe, not being able to be vulnerable, unclear objectives, but also potentially different expectations, too structured or too unstructured, closed-ended, and no feedback. Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about the distinction between unsafe and unvulnerable, because I think there are a lot of interpretations to that.
Yeah, okay. Let me gather up a couple questions and then we'll open it back up. Yeah.
In terms of like not being able to be vulnerable or the different objectives within the group, I mean, as an instructor, sometimes I struggle with my kind of implicit assumptions about what it means to be a peer. That's a lot easier when it's in a class where that assumption is maybe easier, but especially when you've got a guest, in your example, a guest, and then the students in that organization, you do see each other as peers on some level, but maybe not in the same way that students in the classroom do. So how to think about what it be a peer in peer learning.
Yep. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yes.
I'm wondering about the relationship between feedback that comes from outside the group of peers and then how the group of peers learns to give feedback to each other.
Yeah. And I think that's related to these feelings of needing to be vulnerable or safe, right? Like how do you communicate that within the group? How do you get to a place of clear expectations? How do you offer feedback? Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to learn a little bit more about the too structured or completely unstructured part, how we can do. We've always struggled with making this balance.
Right, right. Okay. So, all right, last one, and then we'll come back to discussion.
So this goes back to what you said before. I'm curious as to like your thinking between how do you set the culture? How much of it are preconditions that like structural things or whatever that the either the class or whomever set up, and how much of it is that kind of training or educating or trying to figure out how to align the students? I mean, they're all interrelated, but I'd like to hear, because some of the things I heard I interpreted more as preconditions that may be created by whomever's creating the course or experience, and others I could go either way and I could be completely interpreting different things more.
Thank you so much. So we've had a couple of questions that get at the kind of nature or culture of that interaction, whether it's one-on-one or in a group. Where are some of those conditions or expectations coming from? And then how do they differ in contexts where how you define a peer may be different, right? So maybe not a classmate, but someone your same age, or someone a different age, but from the same background as you. How do you think about some of those things? But I want to start with Lee's question in the back about those distinctions between safety and vulnerability.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question. In terms of safety, when I say that, I mean specifically with regard to your identity. I come into my interactions very aware of the fact that I am a woman, I am Black, and I am a Black woman. And I think that there are certain sensitivities that educators who I've interacted with, and even learners that I've worked with, have had to have in interacting with me, whether it's the language that they use, the liberties that they take in interacting with me, or in discussing certain things with me. I think that contributes a lot to safety. And this can extend to sexuality. It can extend to any part of your identity that's particularly salient in that moment. In terms of vulnerability, I think I'm speaking more so to what you two said earlier about challenges in the classroom and thinking about whether or not I can share where I am deficient, whether or not I feel like I can be honest with you about the fact that I've only had chemistry from a textbook in high school, or I've never seen a laboratory before, or I don't know where to get the acetone from. And those are things that I think a lot of people make assumptions about. You're at Harvard, you're smart, you can do this. Like, you know, those are dumb questions, even though there are no dumb questions. I want to be able to say, actually, I don't know. And if I can't be vulnerable enough to say that, not only am I holding myself back, I'm also holding back a learning moment for you as my educator.
Thank you so much for that. I think that piece of being able to be honest and vulnerable speaks to some of the challenges that other people raise too, right? About differing expectations. How do you have that conversation? If you don't feel like you can have that conversation, you're never going to get past that, sort of bringing different expectations to the table. And same with what Michael was saying about feedback, right? It's all kind of related in that space of being able to talk honestly about not just the sort of so-called content of what you're dealing with, but the nature of the interaction, the process as well. Did you want to add something, Max?
Maybe just I really appreciate your reflection. To build on that, connecting to some of the other points, I think it's easy to look at what appears at first as organic ecosystems of peer learning and think that it just happened miraculously, where often it takes like time and work at the outset, like to build those shared assumptions and norms about how we interact, how we kind of talk about our knowledge or lack of knowledge. You need to not only like make that explicit, you need to practice it, you need to reflect on it and say, how did we do with this? And I often find that like every class session often begins at the beginning of the year with like, oh, let's talk about the norms, and that's not really talked about again. So maybe we're used to rolling our eyes a bit at that part. But I think it is actually so critical to think about building in and practicing those skills of working with one another in a way that allows people to be vulnerable. And I think that is huge, but it's often invisible when you look at very successful learning ecosystems.
So I wonder, Michael, if you want to respond to that, because you work on building these formal structures, yet we've talked a lot about the benefits of some of those unexpected or organic moments.
Yeah, I think we're doing great. And I'd also like to address the question about the difference between instructor feedback and then peer feedback to one another. I feel that peer feedback is the optimal form of communication related to these idea of processes, because who is the instructor to say whether or not something is working within your group? It's the group that knows whether or not it's working. And the instructor feedback can be the one on saying whether, for example, the output, the product, is living up to the course expectations, meeting the criteria communicated on the rubric. All that said, I think there is still an exceptionally important role of the instructor in, as you said, creating the environment up front by communicating norms and expectations, or helping the students themselves develop the norm and expectations, and explicit attention to process, so that students will understand that this feedback to one another about group process and group dynamics is still occurring within a certain context.
And I think quickly, just to piggyback on that, one of the best experiences that I've had in working with an instructor whose course I was seeing for is the fact that they trusted me to do what I set out to do and what they hired me to do. And knowing, and again, having those open lines of communications to correct me or to welcome me into, a feedback conversation if that's necessary.
Thank you for that. It's striking to me how similar some of these asks are to things we talk about more broadly in pedagogical spaces, of the kind of making transparent some of the structures and expectations that we have, making that hidden curriculum transparent. And one of the areas that I'm not sure we have talked as much about more generally is sort of how do we communicate that about peer learning as well, rather than just sort of saying, like, this is your group project, now go do it, sort of helping students to think through what might that look like? What would a positive version of this be for you? If this happens, maybe that wasn't such a positive experience. Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, I had like a twofold question. So in terms of peer evaluation, which I agree with you is a great, you have to evaluate the group from within the group. Were you ever asked about a category, something along the lines of empathy, which might actually, like, is this an empathetic peer? Was that ever part of the evaluation?
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what is, in your opinion, when you're working as a group, as peers on a project, what is the most fair grading policy? Do you want us to grade you as a group? Do you want us to have an individual component? I just want to hear that from you. Like, we're, here to elevate peer instruction.
Yeah.
Think about the learning experience rather than your grade.
Max, do you have I'm going to put you on the spot first, and then we'll come back to the undergrads.
It's a huge tension, right? Because the second you put a grade on something, it becomes about the grade and not about the substance. And that's not because we're crazy. It's because, there are high stakes to this world, and the grades matter for many people. So I think, the less you can make it about that, the better, so long as you're still communicating clear expectations and that there's some level of social accountability. I found in groups, it is often helpful to have both an individual and a team component. It can be more open-ended, writing reflections on what worked well, what didn't, because sometimes there are cases where one group member just doesn't do their share, and that can really ruin an activity for the rest of the group. So I think providing a space to look both at the individual contributions and at the whole group, because again, we're trying to build this skill of working in a group, so it makes sense to give people individual feedback, notwithstanding your point that I think peers are best positioned to do that around how they are participating in that group.
It's interesting because it does get to something that we've tried to not talk about, which is what are some of these other conditions, right? What are the evaluative mechanisms? Why are you engaged in this peer experience? Julia, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was actually just going to touch upon that. So I think something important to think about when evaluating group work is what was the purpose of working in that group? Because if that purpose is to build that kind of teamwork skills and the ability to work with people who you might not necessarily usually get to work with, then I think that the grade should encompass that group component. However, are you giving students every opportunity to develop their skills and succeed in a structured way in that group? And so I think that while grading as part of a whole group is fine and necessary in some cases, depending on what that assignment is, I think that guiding students and giving them the tools to really discuss and evaluate their contributions to the group and how they might be able to best work most effectively in that group is a necessary component before the grading ever comes in. So that could, I'm just thinking off the top of my head right now, but that could involve peer-to-peer evaluations that are structured by the that are given by the instructor but never seen by the instructor. So giving students a more structured ability to really evaluate their participation within their group. And then from a more grading and structure evaluation standpoint, to make sure that every student is kind of pulling his or her own weight, perhaps while grading the group as a whole still requires students perhaps at the end of the project to list how they specifically contributed to their group or what they think they added to their group, so that the instructor also has some kind of knowledge of what each student was bringing to that experience.
That's great. Thank you so much. I want to shift a little bit to thinking a little bit about how the co-curricular or outside the classroom experiences with peer learning shape some of the way that you've thought about it. So, we've talked a little bit, what we've implied here is sort of classroom or content-based peer-to-peer. We've sort of touched upon some individual peer-to-peer stuff, one-on-one. We've talked about group work. We've talked a little bit about some of the groups that you've been part of, in which maybe it's a more flat structure or maybe there's some hierarchy. But I'm sort of curious, when you think outside of the classroom, since it seems that many of you talked about how that shaped your attitude about peer experiences and how rich that was, what are some of the things that you find to be consistent, and what are some of the things you find to be different about classroom-based peer-to-peer experiences and co-curricular peer-to-peer experiences? Thanks, Max.
Sure. I think it's easier outside. Like I think you're kind of swimming upstream in classroom contexts, and you're kind of going with the stream outside.
Wait, can you unpack that metaphor a little bit?
Yeah, like in a classroom context, you have 60 or 90 minutes of time to work with. You have to grade it. You have everyone seated in a place like this. It's probably kind of aligned with students' interests, but not totally. While if you're doing a peer learning experience in kind of outside of classroom context, it's like the stuff you care about, a self-selected group of people, you meet on your own times, maybe on weekends in more sustained ways. So I think you are, it's harder. However, I think there's a tendency to not take seriously the stuff that happens outside of classrooms as pedagogical experiences. Mm-hmm. And actually a lot can be learned by what makes those experiences successful. But I think they do just resemble a lot of things we've been talking about, where they are more, they're more sustained over time, there are clearer roles and expectations, there's a clear product that they're working towards or a real goal. I think there's a lot to be learned from them.
Thanks for that. I would add, I think, to maybe them not being taken as seriously is them not even being fully acknowledged in the classroom, right? That there may be norms around interacting with your peers that are established in spaces that are not the classroom that carry over. There may also be existing relationships that carry over. Yeah. Lena, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think also there's a difference in motivation. You kind of touched on too, but when you're in a classroom, I think a lot of the motivation is sort of towards a grade or coming from, trying to please a teacher or like an outside sort of motivation. Whereas when you're doing co-curricular stuff, whether it's like with a tutor that you've requested or that you kind of chose to work with on the side, or in like a student group, a lot of that is because you really want to do this and you're doing it for yourself and because that's something that you've chosen. And so I think that's a big difference that kind of carries through to the actual learning itself.
Thank you so much for that. I want to highlight something that you just said because I think it's really important. that we're drawing a distinction between things that happen in the classroom and things that happen outside the classroom, not necessarily things that are academic in nature and things that are not academic in nature. So you grouped tutoring in with the student group work, right? Because I think it speaks to what Max was raising about the structure in which you're doing that, the motivation that you're bringing. I think that's really, really fascinating that it's not somehow inherent in the subject matter, right? But in the nature of how that experience is structured and how you decide to engage with it. Did you want to add something too?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you made a really awesome point about rewards as incentive to buy in a classroom setting. But I also want to make sure that we don't forget that there's also some element of punishment that is being avoided outside of the classroom, and that there are generally no stakes if you fail. The risk of failure is essentially eliminated when you're outside of a classroom. The worst that will happen to me in a co-curricular setting is that I find out what the right thing is, and I move on and I implement it. But in a classroom setting, that can be a failing grade, that can be reprimand, that can be a lot of different things. And so thinking about what students or participants are avoiding as well when they are navigating these interactions is important too.
Can I challenge you though a little bit on that? Because I think there are ways that there are different consequences in some co-curricular spaces. So Max, you used the word social accountability before, right? And I think that's much heightened in some of the co-curricular spaces, right? And it can be easy to kind of give into that, right? That's really stressful or important, but at the same time it feels inherent to you and what you want out of something.
And I think it just I think what you're saying is correct. Like, I agree with that. I think, again, though, the way that we think about learning and even how we position meritocracy in the society, the weight, like, we can't ignore the fact that grades, performance, academic success are like key motivators, and alternatively, the fear of that failure can be like one of the drawing factors. So while there are like some consequences that are pretty serious in co-curricular settings, I do think there is a little less pressure in that way based on the expectations that we have around us.
Totally. Yeah. Yes.
The dialogue that we've just had, I think for me is really profound, because we're talking about high levels of engagement, motivation, less fear of failure, and all these things that are so incredibly positive, and yet somehow we've designed those out from some of our formal learning spaces. And I think this dialogue around peer learning is trying to bring some of that back in. So I think that discussion is profound as part of the why of this, actually. And I think it's been illustrated beautifully by that discussion.
Thank you so much for that. That actually brings me to my surprise question. Surprise to them. But we've touched upon it in a couple different ways. But my question to you is, who is a peer? And this obviously is situational. So I want you to think about maybe a moment where you actually felt like someone was a peer with you in a surprising way, or you felt like, I'm not engaging with this person as a peer, even though by all appearances they should be, or I expected them to be. So part of why I'm asking this is because in preparation for this, Allison Pingree and I were able to do some focus groups with students. And one of the most powerful things that came out was somebody talking about how their thesis advisor felt like a peer to them, even though they were their thesis advisor, right? And so what was the nature of that relationship? How did it come out to be like that? And so I'm sort of curious if there are ways to reflect on who is or can be a peer, because I think it gets to your point about what are some of the qualities, right? It doesn't have to be inherent in you're a student, I'm a student, so we're peers, right? What are some of the qualities of peerness that we might be able to cultivate in other contexts?
Yeah, so I think for me, a big thing about being a peer and peer-to-peer interactions is understanding that the person that you're talking to has been through and understands the same thing that you've been through. So in a classroom setting, and something that I know as course assistants and peer study leaders, we try to really connect to is that the person who's up lecturing in front of the class has been is typically many years away from when they first learned that material. Whereas we as peer study leaders learned that material last year or a couple years ago, and so we can anticipate and understand where students might feel like they might not be grasping the material before those students even realize it themselves. But for me, something that I thought was interesting was that I had this experience in a class that I took last year where there was a preceptor in the class who at first I had that kind of instructor-student relationship with, but as the class evolved and as the semester evolved, it melded into what I felt was more of a peer-to-peer relationship because they were able to connect with me in a way that made me feel that they understood directly the pitfalls that I was getting in what I was learning, and were able to help me work through those and anticipate them in a way that was less they're over here and I'm over here. It became more of an egalitarian interaction. And so for me, I think that's kind of how I define a peer, as somebody who can really connect with you because they've been through what you've been through and are very transparent about that.
Yeah, thank you. Lena? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think I have sort of the two experiences that I talked about, kind of working at the Writing Center and then also working at Y2Y. At Y2Y, when there's peer learning, most of the time I have very different experiences from like the guests that I'm serving, and we really share very little kind of past educational experiences, other experiences. I think we definitely do have some things in common, and that's kind of some of the most beautiful parts of like being able to be a staff at Y2Y is seeing those come out. But I think there's actually a lot of similarities if I'm working with a guest at Y2Y and they're, they're filling out an application for a job or something and they're kind of, telling their narrative, similar to like if I'm helping a Harvard student at the Writing Center who's trying to fill out, like a fellowship application or something. I think that I would characterize those both as like peer learning experiences, which are very similar, but don't necessarily require I think they do require a shared experience. I'm actually not sure if I can like put my finger on what makes them so similar. Maybe it's like kind of the collaborative nature. Maybe it's this sort of like more intimate one-on-one thing, but I guess I'd have to think a little bit more. But I think I would characterize them both as peer learning. Yeah.
Excellent.
I think I would advocate for like the most encompassing possible definition of peer that you allow. So like it's like 100 to 0 power differential. Maybe that's not it, but anything where there's any kind of sharing, I would want to call that peer. And I think it kind of goes back to Lena, your point about unequalness as part of this. Like it's just the world where people are going to need to collaborate, and they're not going to all be like perfectly equal in every single respect. There's going to be either formal power differences. There's going to be informal ones. People have different identities that are negotiated in different ways, and I think part of peer learning is learning how to navigate the kind of inherent different kind of webs of difference among folks, whether formal or kind of identity-based or whatever it is. So I like to that point about anyone, it's situational dependent. Like my advisor has been my teacher, my dissertation advisor. I've been their teaching assistant. We've been co-authors. I've been first author. He's been second author. He's been second author. I've been first author. Like every possible breakdown has existed between us, and each one needs to be negotiated separately. And like kind of what's required for it to be a successful peer learning experience is different, given the kind of differences of that relationship in the context. So very encompassing.
And you also touch upon the idea of a potential evolution in a particular kind of exchange or relationship, right? To go from being a student to being a colleague is also one of the journeys. Naya, you had mentioned earlier about being a learner and then being a teacher in the same discipline, right? Yeah. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe just to summarize what I hear or try to extract a theme. It seems to me that the relationship between peers is defined more by the situation and the task rather than any intrinsic qualities about the two individuals who are coming together to work on it. In the example about the thesis advisor and the student, if they were both at a level of shared inquiry about some new topic that hasn't been researched before, I could very much see that being a peer-to-peer relationship. But if they were in a class where the advisor had all their lecture slides made out and was very clearly the content expert, and that same student was learning all this for the first time, I don't know if necessarily they would feel like they were peers.
Yeah. So can I put a fly in that ointment a little bit and just think about, can you think of a situation where by all appearances you should be interacting with peers, but that's not really what was going on? So I'm thinking of an example where, I enter a meeting or a room and I'm thinking, oh, these people all are have the same role as me, right? But I somehow don't feel like I'm their peer. Maybe they have more experience than I do. Maybe they have more authority than I do. Maybe they have more social capital than I do, something like that. I'm just curious if there are moments, and Lena, you touched upon this a little bit with the Y-to-Y example, where it looks like, right, you're the same age, right? So maybe that makes you peer, but there's so many ways in which you're not. And I just wonder about how situationally we might be able to actually highlight that or build other structures around it to make that more possible, a more possible kind of exchange.
Sure, I guess I can talk. I think Y2Y sort of is a more obvious example of this maybe than what happened in a classroom setting, but it's just the nature of like a student staff who, like I said, has the ability to enforce policies and to sort of decide who gets to stay at the shelter on a specific night and who doesn't. Necessarily kind of, you would think that, oh, we're all around the same age, so it's very equal, but it's not. And I think that can lead to a lot of tensions, with guests who are like, why do you have all this power? You're a Harvard student and I'm not. Like, it's just because of our lives have taken different trajectories. And I think that's kind of why I said that sometimes peer learning does have to be unequal to kind of balance those things out, to kind of make it more like it actually is a peer-to-peer relationship.
Yeah. Go ahead.
One of the things I support is a program where teams of educators come to Graduate School of Education for like a week, and they do an institute, and they meet with their school-based teams. And to your point, I think oftentimes like everything looks great, and then if you dig a little bit, you realize there's this one principal who's just kind of like really domineering, and it's like making everybody else like on edge. But I do think it's really, that happens all the time, and I think it might not be the principal, it might be just a particularly aggressive, teacher, or anything like that. So I think I don't have any great answer or anything, but I do think it lurks below in many cases, and is something that's worth reflecting on and digging into and taking action about it.
Okay. We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to ask the last question that I asked you all to think about, which is, what do you wish your instructors knew about peer learning? So we're going to bring it back to the classroom for a moment. So we already got the group work grading question out of the way, which is good. But are there other things that you wish your instructors knew about your peer learning experiences, good or bad?
For me, I wish that somebody had told me sooner about how valuable those experiences are. For me, I know when I first came to Harvard and I was told in my LPSA class that there were these people called peer study leaders, and like they were here to answer questions and they were undergrads, but then I could also go to instructor office hours or teaching fellow office hours. To me, I was like, oh, why would I go to the undergraduates when like I could go to the big instructors or the graduate students who have had so much more experience with these things? And it took me about a little bit over a half a year to realize that learning from my peers was in many ways more valuable than like going to my instructors or my TFs, because they had been through the same things that I had been through. And so I wish that that had been something that was more emphasized to me when I came to Harvard, because I feel like I've missed out my freshman year on all those valuable learning experiences.
Thank you. Yeah.
Something I would convey to my students is that, one, group processes are a skill. Name it, because it's very easy to overlook that. In medical school, they liken it to keeping up with the curriculum to drinking from a fire hose. And when we're drinking from a fire hose just to keep up with the pharmacology and the anatomy and cell biology and everything else, it's really easy to overlook these dynamics that are happening right in front of us. And secondly, when we are thinking about those dynamics, it's unfortunate, but I feel that many of us have a sort of fixed mindset, to use Carol Dweck's term, that, oh, this group we're not gelling, this isn't working well, and basically you tough it out and put your head down and just do what you have to do to get through it. But as the instructor, to cultivate that growth mindset that, you know what, the behaviors you're demonstrating right now aren't optimal, but with the right attitude, you can try to change those behaviors and develop more productive patterns.
Julia, could I ask you a very, very quick follow-up, or maybe it can't be answered in full now, but sort of short of telling students how valuable peer resources are, which I imagine would be met with a lot of skepticism or a sense of we don't want to do the work, we're outsourcing it to students. For incoming students, that might be how it's felt. What's a way that instructors and administrators can show students how valuable that is?
I think maybe encouraging students, like for us, we're peer study leaders, so we hold office hours. And so I think just encouraging students to try these things out, because I had never been to a peer study leader office hour basically the majority of my freshman year. It was until halfway through my spring semester that I went to one. And then I was like, oh, wow, this was actually really helpful and really cool. But it was just something that I was told it was there, but I was never really encouraged to pursue that. And it was never really emphasized how valuable an experience like that could be. And so I think like making those opportunities available for students isn't always necessarily enough if it's students that haven't previously been exposed to things like that. So I feel like pushing students toward going to those kinds of resources, be it maybe assigning students, like saying like, okay, like I just want to put you in touch with somebody, and making it more individualistic might help. But I think just like really that encouragement, I think is something that's really big, rather than just saying like this resource is here, use it if you want.
I would want my teachers to know that peer learning transcends the classroom. And what I mean by that is that I think sometimes we think about peer learning as helping to meet the objectives that are set within the classroom in 4 classes and 4 courses. And I think in my experiences with, peer learning and thinking through some of these topics and being with a course for a while, I am so much stronger outside of the classroom and outside of this field and outside of this study. And it's helped me to be a better speaker. It's helped me to think about my other courses. It's helped me in taking the MCAT. It's thinking about all of the other ways in which my life has been impacted and changed as an educator, as a participant, as someone who has learned in this system. And so I would want teachers to know, or instructors to know, that like the impact that this will have on your students far exceeds what you can see right now and what you'll be able to see.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I think we're going to end on that note, that really beautiful note. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, but thank you especially to you 5.